Opening. On July 20th, 1969, more than 600 million people around the world stopped what they were doing and watched the same thing. They gathered around television sets in living rooms, in bars, in public squares. They watched grainy black and white images transmitted from 238,000 miles away. They watched as a human being stepped onto the surface of another world for the first time in history. This is the story of one family that watched that moment, the Chen family of Houston, Texas, and their father, William, an engineer who had worked on the Apollo program and knew the 1,000 ways the mission could fail. Houston, Texas, July 1969. Houston, in the summer of 1969, was the center of the space program. The Manned Spacecraft Center, later renamed Johnson Space Center, employed thousands of people dedicated to putting Americans on the moon. The city lived and breathed space exploration. Neighborhoods were filled with engineers, scientists, technicians, and their families. Everyone knew someone who worked on Apollo. William Chen was one of those engineers. He had emigrated from Taiwan in 1958 to study aerospace engineering. He had joined NASA in 1963, drawn by President Kennedy's bold promise to land a man on the moon before the decade ended. For 6 years, William had worked on the Lunar Module, the fragile spacecraft that would carry 2 men down to the moon's surface. William lived with his wife Grace and their 3 children in a modest house in Clear Lake, a Houston suburb popular with NASA families. Their son Robert was 17. Their daughters Linda and Susan were 14 and 11. The children had grown up in the shadow of the space program. They understood that their father was part of something historic. But they also understood how dangerous it was. The background. The race to the moon had consumed America for most of the 1960s. President Kennedy had made the promise in 1961. The Soviet Union had been winning the space race. First satellite, first man in space, first spacewalk. America needed a victory. Landing on the moon before the Soviets became a national obsession. NASA had built the Apollo program from nothing. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, had died in a fire during a launch pad test in 1967. The program had nearly ended that day, but NASA had pressed forward. They had redesigned the spacecraft. They had tested and retested every system. And now, in July 1969, they were ready. Apollo 11 launched on July 16th. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins sat atop a Saturn V rocket and blasted into space. The mission was simple to describe and incredibly difficult to execute. Fly to the moon, land on the surface, walk outside, collect samples, return home alive. William Chen knew every technical detail of the lunar module. He knew its strengths and its weaknesses. He knew how many things had to go perfectly right for the astronauts to survive. And he knew that space was unforgiving of mistakes. July 16th, the launch. The Chen family watched the Apollo 11 launch on television. The massive Saturn V rocket stood on the pad at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the most powerful machine ever built by humans. At 9:32 a.m., the engines ignited. Flames erupted from the base. The rocket slowly lifted off the pad, rising on a pillar of fire. William watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He had worked on components of that spacecraft. His calculations, his designs, his work was part of the mission, but he also knew the risks. One failed valve, one broken wire, one miscalculation could end in disaster. Grace saw the tension in her husband's face. "They'll be fine," she said quietly. "You made sure of that?" William nodded but said nothing. There were too many variables, too many things outside his control. July 17th to 19th, the journey. For 3 days, Apollo 11 traveled through space toward the moon. The spacecraft was tiny, 3 men crammed into a capsule smaller than a van. They had no way to turn around if something went wrong. They were committed to the journey. Either they would reach the moon and return home, or they would die in space. William went to work at the Manned Spacecraft Center each day during the transit. The Mission Control Center hummed with activity. Rows of consoles staffed by engineers and flight controllers. Giant screens on the front wall showing the spacecraft's trajectory. Everyone monitoring telemetry data, looking for any sign of problems. William worked in a back room, supporting the flight controllers. If anything went wrong with the Lunar Module, he would be part of the team troubleshooting the problem. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. 2 men's lives might depend on his expertise. At home, the children followed the mission on television. Walter Cronkite provided constant updates on CBS News. The networks had dedicated their coverage to Apollo 11. Nothing else seemed to matter. The whole world was watching 3 men fly to the moon. July 20, lunar orbit. On July 20, Apollo 11 entered orbit around the moon. The spacecraft disappeared behind the moon for periods when it passed out of radio contact with Earth. Each time, Mission Control waited anxiously for the signal to return. Each time, the spacecraft emerged safely on the other side. That morning, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climbed through the tunnel connecting the command module to the Lunar Module. They sealed the hatch behind them. The Lunar Module, call sign Eagle, separated from the command module. Michael Collins would remain in orbit while his crewmates descended to the surface. William Chen was at Mission Control when Eagle began its descent. The Lunar Module fired its descent engine and started the long fall toward the moon's surface. This was the moment William had worked toward for 6 years. His design, his calculations, were being tested in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. The descent took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of precise engine burns, computer guidance, and human decision-making. Any mistake would be fatal. The moon had no atmosphere. If the engine failed, there would be no second chance. Armstrong and Aldrin would crash into the surface at hundreds of miles per hour. The alarms. 4 minutes into the descent, alarms started sounding in Eagle. The computer was overloaded. Warning lights flashed. Armstrong's voice came over the radio, calm but concerned. "Program alarm, it's at 12:02. In Mission Control, controllers scrambled to understand what was happening. A 12:02 alarm meant the computer was trying to do too many things at once. Was it serious? Should they abort the landing? William Chen stood in the back room, his heart pounding. This was not something they had planned for. The alarm kept sounding. Eagle was still descending toward the surface. They had seconds to make a decision. A young flight controller named Steve Bales made the call. The alarm was not critical. The computer was still functioning. The landing could continue. "Go," he said. We'll go on that alarm." William exhaled. The mission was still alive, but they weren't down yet. Low on fuel. Eagle descended through 1,000 feet, then 500 feet. Armstrong looked out the window and saw the planned landing site. It was covered with boulders. Too dangerous to land there. He took manual control and flew the lunar module forward, searching for a safer spot. Buzz Aldrin called out altitude and velocity numbers. 400 feet down at 9, 300 feet, 200 feet. In mission control, the flight controllers watched the fuel gauge. Eagle was supposed to land with plenty of fuel remaining, but Armstrong's diversion was burning through their reserves. They had 60 seconds of fuel left, then 40 seconds, then 30. If the fuel ran out before they landed, the engine would quit. Eagle would crash. There would be no survivors, no rescue. Armstrong and Aldrin would die on the moon. William Chen watched the numbers on the screen. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The lunar module was his design. If it failed now, if Armstrong and Aldrin died, it would be his failure, his responsibility. 20 seconds of fuel remaining. Contact. Contact light, Aldrin said. A probe extending from Eagle's landing leg had touched the surface. Armstrong shut down the engine. Eagle dropped the final few feet and settled onto the moon. "Shut down," Armstrong said. For a moment, there was silence in mission control. Then the controllers erupted in cheers and applause. Eagle had landed. Armstrong and Aldrin were alive on the surface of the moon. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The voice of Capcom Charlie Duke responded, barely containing his emotion. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again, thanks a lot." William Chen sat down heavily in his chair. His hands were shaking. They had done it. Against impossible odds, against 1,000 potential failures, they had put men on the moon. And the lunar module, his lunar module, had worked perfectly. The wait. Armstrong and Aldrin were supposed to sleep before going outside. They had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Mission Control wanted them rested before attempting the moonwalk, but the astronauts were too excited to sleep. They asked permission to skip the rest period and go outside early. Houston approved. The moonwalk would happen that evening instead of the next day. William Chen left Mission Control and drove home. Grace and the children were waiting for him. They had been watching on television. They had seen the landing. They knew the mission was succeeding, but the most dangerous parts were still ahead. The moonwalk, then the launch from the lunar surface, then the rendezvous in orbit, then the journey home. So many opportunities for disaster remained. "Are they going to be okay?" Susan asked her father. William looked at his youngest daughter. She was 11 years old, too young to understand all the risks, but old enough to be frightened. He wanted to reassure her. He wanted to promise that everything would be fine. But he was an engineer. He dealt in facts and probabilities, not false comfort. "They've made it this far," he said carefully. "Every step has gone well. They have a good chance." It was the most honest answer he could give. July 20, evening. The world watches. By 10 p.m. Eastern Time, more than 600 million people around the world were watching television. It was the largest audience in human history. They watched in America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. They watched in countries that were allies and in countries that were enemies. For a few hours, the Cold War seemed to pause. The moon landing wasn't just an American achievement, it was a human achievement. The Chen family gathered in their living room. William sat in his armchair. Grace sat on the sofa with Susan beside her. Robert and Linda sat on the floor in front of the television. The room was dark except for the glow of the TV screen. Walter Cronkite narrated the coverage on CBS. The network showed live video feed from the moon, grainy, black and white, barely recognizable, but undeniably real. A camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage provided the view. At 10:39 p.m., the hatch on Eagle opened. Neil Armstrong began climbing down the ladder, 9 rungs from the top of the world, or rather, from another world entirely. The Chen family watched in silence. William's throat felt tight. This was the moment. Everything they had worked for, everything Kennedy had promised, everything America had strived toward for 8 years. It came down to this: one man climbing down a ladder onto the surface of the moon. One small step. Armstrong reached the bottom of the ladder. His boot hovered over the lunar surface. Then he stepped down. His foot pressed into the gray dust of the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The words echoed through televisions around the world. In the Chen living room, no one spoke. Susan had tears running down her cheeks. Linda held her hand over her mouth. Robert stared at the screen in wonder. Grace looked at William and saw that he was crying silently. William Chen had come to America 11 years earlier with almost nothing. He had worked his way through graduate school. He had dedicated himself to this mission. And now, watching that grainy image on the television, watching Armstrong walk on the moon, he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel: pride. Not just in the mission, but in himself, in what he had contributed, in what humans could accomplish when they set aside their differences and worked toward a common goal. The moonwalk. For 2.5 hours, Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon. They collected rock samples. They planted an American flag. They unveiled a plaque that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." The Chen family watched every moment. They watched Armstrong and Aldrin bounce across the lunar surface in the low gravity. They watched them work, their movements slow and careful in the bulky spacesuits. They listened to the conversations between the astronauts and mission control, the technical jargon mixed with wonder and excitement. At one point, President Nixon called from the White House. His voice transmitted across 238,000 miles of space to reach the 2 men on the moon. "This certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made," Nixon said. William thought about that. A telephone call to the moon. 10 years earlier, it would have been science fiction. Now it was reality. The impossible had become possible. Return to Earth. The moonwalk ended. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into Eagle. They sealed the hatch. They rested for a few hours. Then came the moment William Chen feared most: the launch from the lunar surface. There was no backup, no rescue mission. The ascent engine on Eagle had to work perfectly. One failed component, one stuck valve, and Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon. They would die there when their life support ran out. The world would watch them die, helpless to intervene. The ascent engine fired on July 21st. Eagle lifted off the moon and climbed into orbit. The engine worked perfectly. Rendezvous with Collins in the command module succeeded. The 3 astronauts were reunited. They began the journey home. William Chen finally allowed himself to believe they would make it. The hardest parts were over. Barring catastrophic failure, Apollo 11 would return safely to Earth. July 24. Splashdown. Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24. The three astronauts were recovered by the USS Hornet. They were healthy. The mission was complete. America had won the space race. President Kennedy's promise had been fulfilled. Before the decade ended, Americans had walked on the moon and returned safely to Earth. The Chen family watched the splashdown on television. When the capsule was safely aboard the carrier, when the astronauts emerged and waved to the cameras, Grace Chen hugged her husband tightly. "You did it," she said. William shook his head. "We did it, thousands of people, all working together." But Grace knew the toll the mission had taken on him. The stress, the sleepless nights, the fear that something would go wrong. Now it was over. The moon had been reached. History had been made. The aftermath. The Apollo program continued for 3 more years. 12 men eventually walked on the moon. But Apollo 11 was the first. It was the mission that mattered most. The mission that defined a generation. For William Chen, the moon landing was the pinnacle of his career. He worked on later Apollo missions, but nothing matched the intensity and importance of Apollo 11. He had been part of something historic, something that would be remembered centuries from now. Long after nations rose and fell, people would still know that in July 1969, humans walked on another world for the first time. The children grow. Robert Chen became an aerospace engineer like his father. He worked on the space shuttle program in the 1980s. He never forgot watching the moon landing as a teenager. It had inspired him to follow his father into the space program. Linda became a science teacher. She taught her students about Apollo 11. She showed them the videos of Armstrong's first step. She tried to convey the significance of that moment. Most students listened politely, but didn't fully grasp it. They had grown up in a world where space travel existed. They couldn't imagine a time when reaching the moon seemed impossible. Susan became a writer. She wrote about her father's work on Apollo. She interviewed other NASA engineers and astronauts. She tried to capture in words what it had been like to be part of the moon landing, the dedication, the fear, the triumph. She wanted people to understand what that generation had accomplished. 50 years later. In July 2019, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing was celebrated worldwide. Documentaries were made, articles were written. The aging astronauts who had gone to the moon were interviewed. The world paused to remember what humans had achieved half a century earlier. William Chen was 90 years old in 2019. He attended anniversary events in Houston. He spoke at a symposium about the engineering challenges of Apollo. He was interviewed for a documentary about the Lunar Module. Reporters asked him what the moon landing had meant. "It meant that nothing is impossible," William said. "We decided to do something that had never been done, something that seemed impossible. And we did it, not because it was easy, but because it was hard, because it challenged us to be better than we thought we could be." The interviewer asked if humans would ever return to the moon. William smiled. "We will," he said. "Maybe not in my lifetime, but we will, because that's what humans do. We explore, we push boundaries, we go to places we've never been. The moon was just the beginning." The legacy. The Apollo 11 moon landing remains one of the greatest achievements in human history. It demonstrated what could be accomplished through determination, ingenuity, and cooperation. It showed that humans were not bound to Earth. We could reach out and touch other worlds, but it also showed something else. It showed that great achievements require sacrifice. They require dedication. They require thousands of people working toward a common goal, each person doing their small part to make the impossible possible. William Chen was one of those thousands. He wasn't famous. His name doesn't appear in history books, but the lunar module that carried Armstrong and Aldrin to the surface contained his work, his calculations, his designs. He was part of it, and that was enough. William's testimony. William Chen died in 2020 at the age of 91. He died having seen humans walk on the moon, having been part of making that happen, having contributed to one of the defining moments of the 20th century. In his final years, he often thought about July 20th, 1969, about sitting in his living room with his family, watching that grainy image on the television, about seeing Armstrong's boot touch the lunar surface, about feeling for the first time that anything was possible. "We were part of something bigger than ourselves," he said in one of his last interviews. "We were part of humanity reaching out to the stars." And for a moment, just a brief moment, the whole world stopped fighting and looked up at the moon together. That's what I'll remember most. Not the technical achievements, as impressive as they were, but the fact that for a few hours, 600 million people around the world watched the same thing and felt the same wonder. We were united. We were one species looking at what we had accomplished together. That's the real legacy of Apollo 11. Closing. This is William Chen's story. This is his witness to the moon landing. This is what it meant to be an engineer on the Apollo program, to work for years on a mission that could fail in 1,000 ways, to watch as astronauts risked their lives using equipment he had designed, to see the impossible become possible. The footprints Armstrong and Aldrin left on the moon are still there. They will remain there for millions of years. There is no wind on the moon to erase them, no rain to wash them away. They are permanent marks of human achievement, evidence that we were there, that we reached out and touched another world. William Chen's contribution to putting those footprints there is less visible, but it was no less real. He was one of thousands who made it possible, who worked behind the scenes, who solved the technical problems, who turned dreams into reality. On July 20th, 1969, humans walked on the moon. More than 600 million people watched it happen. And in a living room in Houston, Texas, a family gathered around a television and witnessed history. They watched as the impossible became possible, as humanity took its first steps beyond Earth, as the future arrived. That moment, that shared experience of watching humans walk on another world, connected people across the planet. It reminded them that despite their differences, despite the conflicts and divisions, they were all part of the same species, the same journey, the same story. The moon landing showed what humans could accomplish when they worked together toward a common goal, when they set aside their differences and focused on what united them rather than what divided them. It was a moment of hope, a moment of possibility, a moment when the future seemed bright and limitless. We haven't been back to the moon since 1972. More than 50 years have passed. The people who made Apollo happen are aging. Soon they will all be gone. The moon landing will transition from living memory to history. Future generations will learn about it in textbooks, the way we learn about Columbus or the Wright brothers. But for those who witnessed it, who lived through it, who were part of it, people like William Chen, the moon landing remains vivid, real. immediate. They remember where they were when Armstrong took that first step. They remember the feeling of witnessing something that would never be forgotten. They remember when humanity reached for the stars and didn't fall short. This is their testimony. This is their witness. This is the story of July 20th, 1969. The night the world watched the moon. The night one small step changed everything.